All right. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. This is Dispersing the Fog. This is episode 26, August 31st, 2025. I'm Adam Rogers here with Paul Palango. How are you doing, Paul? There we go. See your
Same
cover
old
set.
Sunday. It's
Yeah. The end of the summer, though, this is it. We're getting down. It's no longer beach weather here in Nova Scotia, or it's getting on the very edge of it anyway.
Was it beach weather ever?
I just got back from I was camping for a few days this week. I snuck in a little camping trip before the end of the summer, and it was on the North Shore, right, in the Northumberland Strait between Nova Scotia and PEI up in Pictou there. And it was beach weather still there. It was warm enough to go in, and lots of people were. So, but that's about here on the Atlantic coast, not so much.
Well, on our coast, I saw the CBC video of the giant shark in the bay, not far from us at Hubbard's. So
Yeah, we were we
I'm
were
not.
conscious of that too, going
uh,
out into the water very far. Like, well, I wonder what would you do if one came along?
Well, did you see that video with the great white coming up near Deep Cove, just near Hubbard's, which is not that far from me? The two divers were down there, and all of a sudden, this great white comes up and sniffs them.
I thought, and they said it was a
Look it
great
up.
thing. They were thrilled by it. I'd be less than thrilled, but there was another one too with a paddle boarder where the shark came up and actually took a little there was a tooth mark or a scrape or something with it. Anyway, we didn't run into anything that exciting, but lots of good times. Not as many people in the campgrounds, Paul, with the old fire ban, but
Mhm.
still a good time as always. Although actually up our way, the fire ban's still on, but we're allowed to go into the woods at least. So that's a slight change.
I just walk on the pavement. There are
Yeah.
no ticks. There are no ticks there.
No ticks. I thought, well, maybe not going in the water, but I thought you might be a long walks on the beach kind of a guy.
Eventually, maybe.
Yeah. All right, Paul, we've got
Not my sport.
no, we've got a great show here lined up ahead of us. So we have Tom Jubie coming back on, and we had Tom on before talking about forensic details, and he is really one of the leading voices in Canada on these kind of issues. Talking before about the mass shooting in Nova Scotia, the Mass Casualty Commission findings, and some questions about that. We're going to continue that conversation, but more so get into the book and the experiences that Tom had at the Swiss Air disaster here off the coast of Nova Scotia 27 years ago on September 2nd, 1998. So,
And why is that important, Adam?
well, why is that important, Paul?
It's important because even though it was 27 years ago, people have most people have a fixed opinion about what happened there. And this is a good way to show how what you read and what you know isn't necessarily true. And I think Tom Jubie, from people who have met him in the past on our show, see him as a credible guy, not a crazy. And I think we're going to give him the time to explain what he saw as the chief forensics guy at Swiss Air and what happened to him as an example of how things are essentially covered up in plain sight.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, I was in university when Swiss Air when the crash took place, and followed it, of course, because it was a big Nova Scotia story and a big disaster, but wasn't really aware of the controversy surrounding it, as most people would not be. And that's kind of the way things tend to go, isn't it, Paul? I mean, there's a narrative gets formed, and that's just what everybody knows, unless you're intimately involved, perhaps.
And there's a really good story yesterday. I just passed it along to you. I saw it. And I referred to this in 22 Murders in the book and again in Anatomy of a Cover-Up. The fact that Wikipedia, in this story, it says Wikipedia, which people rely on for information, shapes public opinion by the way it is edited and the facts that they present. And it's not necessarily the true story, it's a version of the story. And just as we're going on today, I said I went back to look at to see how Wikipedia handled the Nova Scotia massacres. And it's essentially the RCMP original narrative, although there now is a reference to 22 murders, not what was in it and what I say and how I counter things. No reference to anatomy of a cover-up. And of the hundred or so articles it cites, there's one by me who's written more about it than anyone else.
Yeah, hundreds. Yeah.
And so if you read the Wikipedia entry, you'd think, well, this is the story, this is the truth. But nothing contrary to the police and the MCC, Mass Casualty Commission, final report is in there challenging it. And that's the point the article was making, that Wikipedia and other sources are shaped by sort of guiding hands who control the story. And this is what happened with Swiss Air, and we're going to show that.
It can have a large effect, this Wikipedia stuff, right? Because of course, when you type in anything, Wikipedia is often one of the, if they have an entry for it, one of the first things that pops up in your Google search, and people will click on that, and all right, that sets the scene for you, right? It gives you a pretty thorough, in many cases, explanation of something, and you assume it to be true because, it's people can correct things that are wrong. Like it's very uh, communitarian in a sense. But one of the problems is, I know these larger organizations, and I'm sure the RCMP being one of them, will have people that are dedicated to checking in on the Wikipedia entries, editing them in a certain way, framing them in a certain way to make sure that that's what the narrative is out there.
And that's exactly what you see there. That, I've made some pretty, I think anyone would agree who's read what I've done would agree that you and me and people we've been working with have made really good arguments based on evidence, and it's totally ignored by Wikipedia and others, which makes me think exactly what you said. The RCMP is essentially editing this, and the government is essentially editing Wikipedia to shape the narrative and
Yeah.
continue with the false narrative that is provably false.
Well, all the more reason for the value of efforts like ours, I guess, and Tom Jubie, who we'll bring on shortly. Want to check in on a couple of stories, Paul, that we've been tracking, and some that we've discussed here on the show. Uh, One that's kind of come up on the radar is this situation out of New Brunswick with a guy that was arrested, seemed to have RCMP uniform. Haven't seen a lot of details on this yet. Something I think that obviously we'll want to investigate and look into. Have you've heard about this guy?
I watched it. I've seen the photos of uniform jackets, and I think he had a car and other stuff. It's like Gabriel Wortman from the Nova Scotia massacres. Not the first time that's happened, not the last. It makes me wonder why these people do this. I could joke they're trying to volunteer to fill in for all the work the RCMP isn't doing and getting paid for. But that's sort of macabre of just being sarcastic.
Yeah.
I think it's something we follow in the future and see what happens. I know there's a lot of people who would like to see him in jail, and that's probably where he's headed. But
Yeah, no doubt. I
uh,
mean, the public just has very little appetite or any tolerance for that kind of thing. I think these days after the Wortman situation. Uh, you mentioned the work they're not doing. There's a story out this week about the RCMP's uh, sick leave thing with some great quotes from Brian Sauvé, of course, about it's trying to the head of the union for the police, National Police Federation, saying, oh, they have tough jobs. 7% of the force is off on leave. Thousands of people off on sick leave, or hundreds off have been off for more than a year, or some more than 2 years. Numbers are kind of staggering.
well, it's what we talked about last week, and this is now coming out. It's like gaining traction. The RCMP sick leave cases climbed 184% in 15 years. Why? Because anyone can take off anytime they want. I mean, I got a note from former Mountie out west. I know members 6 to 9 years on sick leave. We had a female officer 6 years off on sick leave, full pay. Meanwhile, she was a full-time for-profit rancher and farmer. At one point, 70% of our detachment was off on ODS. That's off-duty sick.
Yeah.
One guy went ODS for 1 year because of a groin pull at beer league hockey, making 106,000 sitting on the couch.
Wow.
Meanwhile, there were only two officers on duty in our detachment taking 30 calls a night when there should have been 8 or 10.
Yeah.
And it's insane.
It's such a simple thing, and it's so human nature, right? It's like, okay, you make it easy for people to not work and still get paid. Guess what's going to happen? You know?
Well, and I got a cop the other day who's a good friend and who's been very helpful in doing this story, complaining, well, that was all negotiated. People get sick and that's the way it is, and stop making that's not a big issue. It is a big issue because it gets down to what we talked about before about the lack of conscientiousness. We now have people who are there just for the money, not the duty. And if they can get off and get paid full time sitting on their couch and maybe holding down a full time job, they do it. Yeah, it's human nature, but it's bad human nature. Um, taking home cars, essentially not calling off work because it's a sunny day or you want to go golfing, holding down a second job. This is a lack of conscientiousness.
It's not and not getting any better either. There's studies showing now that the Generation Z and younger generations are uh there's been a decline in conscientiousness
Yeah.
within the generations, and so
Well,
there's gonna have to be better guardrails put in place to prevent these kinds of things.
the one of the problems is another a group of Mounties who now speak to me said said this about the off-duty sick, especially at federal policing. The National Police Federation boss, Brian Sove, and this is a quote, submits to the media that one of the main reasons for long-term ODS is exposure to trauma. That's pure bull. There is next to zero trauma in federal policing. Office hours and only casual interaction with the public. Is that the cause of trauma? The National Police Federation is a real snake. It intentionally conflates and obfuscates issues. No one ever questions an officer on long-term ODS due to involvement in a shooting or a serious car accident. But when officers go on extended sick leave with no nexus to the job, they need to be called on it. Is the trauma due to sitting on a nice leather office chair and watching TV all day? These people are delusional. This is from a Mountie.
Yeah. Well, we saw another former Mountie this week. I guess he's a former Mountie talking about the effects of all this on the capacity of the police, to do complex, modern federal policing. Talking about Gary Clement, Paul. You see his piece this week there, right?
Yeah, that was a really good piece and somebody should look it up on Sam Cooper's The Bureau from out in Vancouver. The headline was Mounties overstretched and overmatched by foreign mafias, no longer fit for service. And this comes from Gary Clement, who I believe was a superintendent when he left the force, and he was best known back in the day for the guy who was involved in the Mountie investigation of Meher Arar back in
Oh, yes.
2006, 7, or prior to that, 2002, 3.
Yeah.
Gary Clement's a highly respected former officer. He now works in the banking. Um, well known. I know who he is. That he has come out now and said, and not mincing any words about the drastic state of affairs inside the RCMP, along with people like former Deputy Commissioner Kurt Allen, who we've had on the show
Yeah.
talking about these very same things. This is a groundswell is building. And again, the government of Nova Scotia wants to make the RCMP the primary police force across Nova Scotia and are not aware of, or not even considering how bad things are. These people are coming out. I've tried to get people to come out for 15 years. Now they're coming out everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I think the word is spreading, and yeah, it's hard to imagine, these very credible voices. It actually seems to be a trend now, doesn't it, for the former senior officers to then go into the banking sector, the financial sector, and do some security there. It's too bad some of that expertise didn't remain back within the force, but I guess they could always
And it all goes
hire them as
down to,
consultants if they still wanted their expertise.
and before we switch over to Tom here,
Yeah,
one of the former Mounties in their note to me said this all goes back to the leadership of the Mounties and the structure of the force.
yeah.
The fact that police cars are being used going by officers as their personal cars, they go shopping in them, etc. It all stems, and this is a quote, it all stems from the top brass's incompetence, arrogance, laziness, and selfishness. They are unable to tell the truth. Lie after lie in the hopes that their lies will eventually settle in the public's mind as truth. Now that they have been exposed, rather than address the issue, they double down on their lies.
Yeah.
And this is exactly a perfect setup to where we're going.
Yeah. All right, just before we bring in Tom, just for the audience, a couple of stories that we were following. Not much of a development, but I'll mention quickly. So the hockey sex assault case out of Kitchener, or sorry, out of Kitchener. No appeal from that from the Crown.
London.
London, sorry, thank you. No appeal from the Crown. No surprise to any legal experts watching it. I know a lot of people seemed upset about that. I could tell you, you don't want a bad decision appealed where you know it's going to lose again because you have then the bad decision in your view is at a higher level of court and is thus more influential. Watch what you ask for, people. You don't want to appeal this case. Second one is out of Lindsay, Ontario, the Kawartha Lake police chief. So with the home invasion, the guy that defended himself against the home invasion and is now been charged with assault. We have a few more details, not much. Guy's name is Jeremy McDonald, 44 years old. It was an apartment attacked at 3:20 in the morning on a Monday, and the home owner, the home occupant, used a knife. That's all we know. This is becoming a huge political issue, Paul, and the Kawartha Lakes police chief is basically saying, "Trust us. We've done the investigation, we've got all the facts, and we've charged this guy. Just trust us that it was over the line." I don't think that's good enough. This is becoming,
Whoa, 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 you're leaving something out.
what's that?
The guy who came through the window was on multiple charges, out on bail on a number of things. They knew each other.
Yeah.
It sounds like they were somewhat disreputable. Oh, yeah, the guy coming through the door had a crossbow.
Oh yeah. So it
So
looks it
the guy
looks
defended
like
himself with a knife.
yeah, it looks like he sh probably should have been able to defend himself to a reasonable or slightly more unreasonable degree. But the police won't tell us what they know. And so people are off imagining all these things about the situation and thinking, oh, poor guy. Well, I think we need to be told more so that people can assess this hot button issue at the moment. Okay. A couple of other stories that are out there, Paul, but I think we'll leave those till next time. And I want to bring in Tom because we have lots to talk about with Tom Jubie. So let's bring him in from the green room or the waiting room. Let me track him down here. Don't really have a green room. All right, here's Tom. Sees Dave. There he is.
Good evening, Tom.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, Tom. Great to see you.
Well, you're back. I want to tell you that I've had numerous listeners saying, "When are you going to have Tom Jubie back?" I know you never thought you'd be so loved and so desired, but there are people who would like to hear from you.
I was going to say, gosh, they must be hard up for people that. No, that's good. That's good.
And they're particularly interested, and maybe we should touch on it briefly on the who shot Corey Ellison, who killed Corey Ellison. Do you have any more thoughts on Corey Ellison to follow up on the from our last talk about it?
Not really. You seem to have covered it very well, and you raised a lot of points. And
What's
I think we went through them.
Well, the whole ballistics thing is just, the lack of ballistic examination. And one of the other questions I had for you, they never tested the guns of any of the Mounties on the scene that day. They never called them in that we know of. But I've been told by other officers that one of the things we should do, and I leave this open to others to do as well, is put into a FOIPOP, an access to information, asking for the examination or the requalification testing for all the officers at Portapic for the last 6 years, and to see if there's anything in the record about any of them switching out their gun. Does that ring with you as being something reasonable to do?
I don't know. I'm pondering that because I've never run into anything like this before, where the idea of switching firearms. Um, I know that I know that some police agencies, or especially down in the States, when there's a shooting like that, um, the firearms get mixed up so that my gun ends up going to someone else the next time, or there's no possession of a particular firearm, so that fingers can't be pointed at an individual who pulled the trigger. Now, I've never heard of that in the RCMP in all of my time. I don't know what the some of the special units. We did have a special unit in Ottawa. Um, I don't know what the ERT teams do in the province when it comes to firearms, whether they just grab one off the shelf or if they're assigned certain to individuals.
I believe all the guns were assigned to individuals. That was marked on their qualifications
So
or
Paul,
their requalifications.
you saying, Paul, then if it's assigned to a particular person, that there would be a record potentially of an officer switching firearms?
I've been
That's what
told,
he's saying.
yeah, that if one of the officers who was involved in the shooting of Corey Ellison, they may well have switched out their gun afterwards, and they're using a different gun now.
It's worth putting in and seeing what kind of results you're going to get. Um, you're going to have to wait for it. That's for sure. If it's anything like what I went through with my stuff, the access to information, uh, a lot of it I had to wait 3 years.
Yeah,
Tom, what you're describing there in the States, are you saying like so that they wouldn't know which officer shot somebody and wouldn't want to know necessarily for some reasons? Who?
That's in a legitimate. Well, of course, they operate so much differently down there, anyways.
Yeah,
But that's in would be for a legitimate takedown.
yeah.
I know the British do that too.
It reminded me of I used to hear stories of the firing
I
squads.
don't understand this. I've never heard of this before.
Oh, so so I was
Well,
thinking.
I've
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
I've heard of it with the SAS, the Special Air Service over in Britain, and they've trained our guys in Ottawa, and their techniques are used by our ERT teams across the country. because they're considered to be the best. Now, the Americans will say otherwise, but the British have been at it a whole lot longer and had a lot of experience.
Just reminded me of the stories you'd hear about shooting squads, and somebody would have one of the shooters would always have a blank, so they weren't quite sure who shot, who actually
Yeah,
hit.
Firing
firing
squad.
squads. Yeah.
Fire squad, yeah. Okay. Well, Tom, we've got a lot to get into with you here about Swiss Air. We've got the anniversary coming up in just a couple of days of the crash in 1998, September 2nd, 229 people killed, and there was an investigation just for the audience. Of course, you know all this intimately well, but just for the audience, the investigation done by the Transportation and Safety Board, assisted by the RCMP, determined that the cause of accident was an accident caused by a fire, electrical fault, and that the plane
An
crashed,
undetermined electrical fault.
undetermined electrical fault. And so the plane crashed. They tried to get to Halifax, but didn't obviously make it. And some of the conclusions I saw, it sounded like they, even if they had known immediately what it was, they still wouldn't have been able to make it. But so okay, so that was one narrative. That was the official word that came out of Transportation and Safety Board, but there was some questions. Um,
Yes, I was involved in it right from the get-go. Um, that morning, I was in the morgue. I helped set up the morgue, and I spent the next 60 days dealing with the body parts. And after 60 days, I went over to the aircraft side and
Before you
worked
move,
in that
before you
hangar.
before you move on, Tom, you were dealing with the body parts. Explain what you had to do to get fingerprints and things like that.
Well, when the plane crashed, when it hit the water, the the fuselage broke apart. It shattered, and it created pieces of the hull that were no bigger than your computer screen, some a lot smaller, and this aluminum and edge on. They're sharp, and the tail met the nose in about a quarter of a second, and everything in that plane went through that mass of broken aluminum shards, and it cut the bodies to pieces. We ended up with, I was given the figure of 22,000 DNA samples, one sample from each piece of flesh that was brought in. Um, we had just, it was just an overwhelming amount of body parts. And it took some time to retrieve everything off the seafloor, and it took a lot of time for the DNA to come back. My job in particular was dealing with fingerprints, and I did logistics and quality control as well. We ended up rolling 1,024 fingers and thumbs, and should have been 229 times 10. So that's how much material that we lost to sea life, etc. But at the same time, we were able to identify 40 people by fingerprints. And of course, everybody was identified through DNA. DNA at the time was in its infancy, and actually, the RCMP had to put in a major effort to get the DNA processing up to speed. It was our crime labs were still just beginning to use it, and it obviously worked to identify all of the people on board. And yeah, like I say,
How did you do the last 40? You said there's 40 people you had difficulty identifying with their fingerprints.
well, we did the process was I was doing fingerprints with a crew of 3 or 4 guys over the 60 days, and there was a crew doing DNA samples. We had dental people in doing teeth. They identified over 100, and everybody was working. Each group was working separately to identify as many as they could, and a lot of people, a lot of those 229 were identified by the three methods. And we're not talking whole bodies. We only had one whole body, and even that body had serious damage to it, wounds to it, injuries. And you're talking one body bag came in, and there were 70 small bags in it with pieces of flesh. In that 70 bags, we identified, I think it was 29 through DNA. And we would get in a hand with maybe 2 or 3 fingers. And this, I'm sorry if this is upsetting to some people, but this is what we had to go through. And we dealt with it in that the fingers were actually severed from the limbs, from the hands, and marked and put in vials. And then our team, my team, and I rolled the fingerprint using various methods. Um, One of them was powder, of course, using fingerprint powder and then rolling it on tape. Um, we had a we had a method that I had known about it some time ago, but I had never used it because you need cadavers to be able to practice it. But the colonel in charge of the Canadian Military Dental Unit, he showed me how to take, of all things, a coffee pot, a coffee maker. It produces the hot water at the ideal temperature, and you put the digit into that hot water at the right temperature, and it causes the outer skin to shed from the inner skin. And you do it for damaged fingers that are you can't normally roll. The outer skin comes off. You take the digit now with just the inner skin, and you create a cast using dental material. You mix the dental stuff, press that finger into the dental cast, and you get a mold. You then create another mold of that to get a duplicate of the digit that you just worked with. And you can roll that. Once it sets up, you can roll that any number of times to create your fingerprint that you can then identify.
Okay, the
Uh,
question I have
that
was,
was a that was a method that was extremely time consuming, but for some of the digits that we had to deal with, that was the only way we could work with them.
do you have a question, Adam, or?
Well, my question, I
Probably
mean,
have lost you.
no, you talk about this very scientifically, Tom, and like I know people that were involved in Swiss Air, and it's just you mentioned yourself, it might be a difficult thing for people to hear. Did you manage it like as a scientist as you're going through this? Is that sort of a way to insulate yourself from, I guess, the potential emotional impact or whatever of it?
I had a problem with the kids. I always have had a problem with children when I attend crime scenes involving kids. And there were youngsters on board this flight, and yeah, I had a problem with that. And um, within the first week, I I ran into a situation where I had to leave the hangar and I had to go for a long walk. Found myself at the end of the runway, and I had to have a talk with myself that, hey, um, get over it. You've got to do this. And it sounds simple now, and it sounds, maybe corny, but it's the idea that it had to be done, and that's the situation you're given.
Yeah.
A lot of people are involved in a lot worse, so handle it and deal with it later. Um, yeah, later on, it affected a lot of people. Most of the people who were in the morgue um, came away with PTSD, and a lot of people out on the water, a lot of the military people on board ship. We had barges out on the water that were, when they pulled the stuff up, they had to sort the material. Um, that was a gruesome job, and yeah, it's
Were
one
you
of those
ever
things.
off on PTSD, or what did you have to receive counseling, or?
Yeah, I wasn't off because I ended up going over to the aircraft side and worked almost 4 years on that. And but when I got through that, I focused on the reconstruction and and put the rest of it behind me for the time being.
So what was your role in
And
the what was your role in the reconstruction, which took place at, and this is important to note,
Yeah.
at the former Shearwater Air Force Base in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia? That's where
yeah, it
the
was it was in Hangar A of the Shearwater base, and my role there. The RCMP had a memorandum of understanding with the Transportation Safety Board. Um, they're a what we would call a civilian agency, and they're not familiar with court proceedings. So we offer them the technical assistance of photography, exhibit control, and that sort of thing. And I went into the hangar to provide photography and exhibit control, as I say, and ended up working with their main scientist, John Garstang. He was engineer scientist. He was in charge of their lab, and I don't think I've ever worked with a guy who was any more knowledgeable about um, mechanical things than him. It was just amazing what he knew about that plane and the workings of the plane. And I worked with him every day for almost 4 years. And I had my job was doing tasks for him, which mainly centered on photographing all of the parts. There were over the TSB says there was 1 million parts. They lost count halfway through because there were many more than that. But we had key pieces of the aircraft that we had to reconstruct. Um, Mainly the area where the fire took place. And every one of those was photographed. I photographed them using a special method um, that I set the piece up and would take 36 photos of it as it turned every 10 degrees. So I had one digital photo every 10 degrees all the way around it. And then depending on the part, I might tip it so that I'm looking up at it, and I might tip it down so that I'm looking down at it. So there's 108 photographs of it that ended up being stitched together in a computer program so that you could take that image on the computer screen and you could zoom into it, or you could look at it from any angle, top, bottom, face on, turn it around, all the way around it, so that it
Okay, was that part of your training, or did you? What were you
that
bring?
was my on the site training from John Garstang. And look, we started out um, we started out in the morgue with the first digital cameras that we had ever used. And we were using the Sony with the little 3.5 inch floppy, the 1.44 meg floppy. And you got 20 photos on the floppy. And then when I got into the aircraft hangar, that quality wasn't there, wasn't sufficient. And it just, I would have had a million floppies by the time I got done. So what we did was we did it all in 35 millimeter film, color film, and it went to Ottawa to be processed in our color lab, in our with the color lab, and then they scanned it with a digitizer to CD and sent us back the CDs, and then they were put into the computer, of course, and worked through the software to put them together to be able to create this program.
Okay,
And and we had thousands and thousands of pieces of aircraft that we did that way. And yeah, one of my main tasks was photographing all of those pieces.
okay, Adam.
Well, it sounds like a little bit of the early Matrix technique of photographing around something, and then you could almost take your computer and just see it from any angle as you wished, right?
It's exactly what it is.
So, so Tom, how did that help you, I guess, when you were trying to figure out what everybody else was trying to figure out, which was what happened? How did the plane crash? Why did the fire start? How did your work inform what you were able to conclude?
Well, number one, I saw every piece of burnt material, and any piece that had smoke on it or appeared to have been melted or been through the fire. The fire was in the forward overhead area of the aircraft, what we in the hangar called the attic. There is no attic in the aircraft, but we gave it the nickname of the attic, and the air techs, that's what they call it. It's overhead the ceiling of the forward galley and the cockpit. That's where the fire was. And I saw every piece of that we retrieved, and I photographed every piece. And in addition to that, I went to Zurich 3 times to see the other aircraft that they had. Swissair had 19 MD-11s, and I was on board 15 of them. And I actually flew on one of them to do a smoke test down in Long Beach, California. So
Was that
3 times I went over. The first two I went with Garstang, and I took thousands and thousands of photographs in the aircraft, panoramas, uh, photographing throughout the airplane, throughout the overhead area, and I saw areas in the aircraft that very few other people, unless you're working for Swiss Air, uh, even know about.
Tom, in the
And
Transportation Safety Board report, they said that there was smoke observed and then no smoke, and that the crew probably thought it was an air conditioning issue. Is that what you
they
were
didn't
coming
know
to
what
agree?
the crew didn't know what the cause of the crash was, or cause of the smoke was. Um, Keep in mind that in 1998, and this astounded me when I heard in 1998, when they smelled smoke, they didn't. The automatic response was not to get to the ground. That what they immediately do is there's a bus bar system in the aircraft. Key or key items are not on the bus bar, but things like the coffee pots or the galleys, um, various things are on a system where they turn a dial and half of the units shut down. If they still smell smoke, well, it's not on that one, so they turn it to the next position, the other half shut down. Well, if they don't smell smoke any longer, well, they know it's on that system. So, okay, let's keep going. Well, they went through that and they still smelled smoke. So, yeah, okay, the fire had gotten to a point where it wasn't controlled anymore by something on that electrical system. And that's when they decided they were going to come into Halifax. And of course, they were too heavy. They had too much fuel on board. If they had landed the way they were, they would have crashed and burned. And so they ended up trying, or they actually did dump fuel out over the ocean and the Aspagog. I can't say it properly.
Aspatagan,
Over,
Aspatagan.
yeah, over the peninsula. There, I can say that one. Anyways, they dumped fuel out there, but by then the fire had gotten beyond the capabilities of being able to continue flying.
Okay, after the plane crash, just to give a bit of background history that's going to lead up to just fill in the audience here with how this worked. About 3 days after, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but about 3 days after the crash, an FAA member in the States said it's likely related to the entertainment system, a failure in the entertainment system, and it got into the issue of Captan tape being controversial, and that narrative continued all the way through till this day, even on Wikipedia that we've talked about earlier in the show, that the entertainment system was the cause of this, and that's what people think. But the final report doesn't say that. The final
No, it
report,
doesn't. The the IFEN system, In-Flight Entertainment Network, IFEN, in the Swiss Air aircraft was unique to Swiss Air. No other airlines had that particular unit. And I spoke with the TSB member who went over to Zurich and went through all of their paperwork on that system. And in the time that they'd had it, the several years that they'd had it in the aircraft, they never once had a problem with their unit. In fact, the way it was wired, the TSB didn't like it. And that's where the big furor came about. They didn't like the way it was wired because it wasn't in that bus system, it was directly into the fuse box. Well, it turns out that the pilots didn't know that. which immediately for me proved that they'd never had a problem. If the pilots had had a problem with it, when they got to the ground and found out from the techs how it was wired, every pilot flying the MD-11 would have known that you had to go to the fuse box to shut it down. They didn't know that, so they'd never had a fault. The other thing is, and I was never privy to the cockpit voice recorder. Only a handful of people ever get to hear what is on the cockpit voice recorder. But it was discussed in the hangar, and one of the TSB members and one of the Swiss Air service managers were talking about it one day, and I was with them, and they said, we had passengers in first class who were gamblers. They were they were every time they got on the plane, it was high stakes gambling. Well, if they're an hour into the flight, if the IFIN system shorts out and goes down, what do you think those guys who have paid $12,000 for their seat in 1998, and one of them is a prince, a Saudi prince, what do you think he's going to say to the flight the flight attendant about his system? He's going to be upset, and what's going on? That stewardess or the maitre d' is going to go to the pilot and say, what's going on with the IFIN system? That never happened. This is from the TSB member and the service manager who knew what was on that voice recorder. That was not part of the recording. It never occurred. So that IFIN system never went down prior to the crash or prior to the major fire.
But isn't it amazing that that narrative has continued to this day, that it's the entertainment system?
That narrative is a red herring as far as I'm concerned. And if I can get to that point later on, it's a smokescreen to appease the public as to what actually caused that crash.
Uh, Tom, really interested you. All right, so you mentioned one of the passengers being this Saudi prince. There were other passengers on the plane, and there was a what listed as a relative of the former Shah of Iran. There were high-level UN officials, and there was $500 million, we're told, of diamonds and gems on the plane that were never recovered. That
We
last,
don't know if they were actually on the plane
okay,
because they were never recovered.
yeah.
And the RCMP never had the American authorities check to see if they had actually gotten on the plane.
Well, that seemed to be the most obvious of the potential points because if somebody robbed the diamonds before they get on the plane crashes, the diamonds are missing, nobody ever finds out. That's one option. Or the other is if the diamonds and gems were actually still on the plane and they disappear, well, what would that do to world diamond markets for other owners of stockpilers of
This was
diamonds?
a this was a high priced display that had been sent over in the States. It was a set of jewels that had been on display.
Okay.
And I don't know who the owner was. I don't know the details of it. The thing is, one thing that I want to mention, um, there was an individual who worked the aircraft when it was in JFK Airport. Between the plane comes in and it's serviced and then it goes out, of course. The servicing staff, there was one individual who worked that one shift, serviced that aircraft, apparently, and was never seen again. He gave false ID, and nobody knows who he actually was, and never seen again.
But let's not get
There's
ahead.
a
Let's
security.
not get ahead of ourselves on that. Let's go back
Okay.
to all the suspects. We'll get to as maybe we're gonna have to do another show on this. But
Well, I'm trying to set the groundwork here
We're
for
doing
before
it.
we
something
before we move
coming.
forward,
Doing great. Another 10 minutes.
what made you suspicious about what really happened after you're taking all your photographs?
Well, when I saw the amount of burn, and there was so much fire damage to the aircraft. Um, the engineers from Boeing and from Swiss Air were all shaking their heads and saying, "We've never seen this before." One very, very key factor, and probably the most important factor, is the fact that we had in the neighborhood of 28 short-circuited wires. When two electrical wires touch, bare wires touch, and if they're charged with electricity, they will short out. It is an electrical term, a short circuit. The metal of the wire melts at a temperature equivalent to that of the sun, and for an instant there's a molten copper bead that forms. Um, it, it instantly melts and then freezes again, it becomes solid. There's a old physics law by the name of set up by a guy by the name of Sievert. It's Sievert's law. When a liquid at any temperature, but liquid at high temperature is surrounded by atmosphere, it absorbs bits of that atmosphere depending on the air pressure and a few other things. But a high temperature liquid, like the bead of a short circuit, will immediately capture the molecules of the air that surround it, so that later on you can tap into that bead of of now solidified copper and determine what those molecules are. The system to do it is Auger electron spectroscopy, or AES, and it was done on our electrical short circuits by a Dr. Brown in Ottawa at the National Research Council, a subgroup called CANMET, CANMET. Dr. Brown had been using Auger electron spectroscopy for almost 20 years. He was, even the TSB members said he was the best in Canada, best in North America, probably best in the world. He had lectured around the world. He had umpteen uh, inventions to do with the equipment. He had been used numerous times for Chalk River, the nuclear plant in Chalk River, to determine faults in their system. Auger electron spectroscopy was key in the um, investigation for the Challenger air shuttle, that disaster that occurred when it blew up in midair. They used AES to help determine the cause of that, and it was widely used in the mining industry, the whole 9 yards. And what happened when he tested the beads? He found high concentrations of magnesium along with iron and aluminum. The beads, that the wires themselves are 99.99% pure copper. Is some of the best electrical wiring in the world goes into those aircraft. It's pure copper. He found high concentrations of magnesium, iron, and aluminum.
What does that tell you?
And that tells me I knew what it was when I heard what he found, but I asked him, you tell me in your words. And he said, there's three possible scenarios. And he said, and he explained the first two. I don't believe that occurred. You had an incendiary device on that plane. An incendiary device, a fire bomb would be the common term. Um, it was something that was made up of magnesium, aluminum, and iron. When you put if you take a bottle cap mixed with magnesium, iron, and aluminum, the powder stirred together, and set it on the hood of your vehicle and light it, just a large beat bottle or whatever of a cap of, maybe an ounce of this material. You light it, it will burn through the engine block and come out the bottom.
Oof.
It's that hot.
Wow.
The military use it as what do they call it? They if they're going to lose an artillery piece, they spike the gun by throwing down one of these grenades filled with magnesium, iron, and aluminum. The space shuttle wouldn't have got off the ground without those ingredients in the solid rocket boosters to increase the temperature of the liquid or the solid petroleum that was in there.
Okay, so
Uh,
you think, we're running out of, are we going to stay for a longer here,
Let's
Adam?
go. Let's go. Maybe another 10 minutes here.
And
Why
then
not?
we'll maybe have to go to another day. But
Yeah.
the question is, so now you think there's an incendiary device on the plane. No one has ever said there's an incendiary device to this day,
except
uh,
me.
except you.
Well,
But you
Jim
seem
Brown.
to
I mean,
have
Jim
evidence.
Brown
And
has said that publicly
I've
too.
seen your evidence. I have like 13,000 pages of evidence that I went through that your evidence. I've seen it bit by bit by bit. You seem to make a good case about this. You think the RCMP and the TSB at the time would be alarmed by this.
They weren't. They were alarmed that I was coming back with this, and they told me to shut up about it. Um, they, I was told that this is secret and don't talk about it. I responded by saying, well, Boeing know about it, Swiss Air know about it, and the TSB know about it, and they have no security clearance. So how can it be secret? Well, don't talk about it in the hangar. Well, I did, and I got into trouble, serious trouble with the RCMP over it. Um, I attended 5 sessions with Dr. Brown, and we went through all of the wires from the aircraft. We also did test wires. I was in Seattle, Washington, and helped set up test wires for AES. We wires in and we submerged them in salt water in the St. Margaret's Bay for 30 days to see if that's where the elements came from, because that was the excuse given by the TSB as to the source for these elements. We searched every piece of aircraft. We tested every piece of aircraft in the area of these wires and could not come up with a source for those elements. Not a viable source. And Dr. Brown submitted 2 reports that said that The first one, he actually used the word sabotage, that the plane had been sabotaged. The second one, he was told to tone down his rhetoric, and he said that there was magnesium, iron, and aluminum, and he could not come up with a source for it.
Tom,
He eventually,
oh, sorry. So one of the things Dr. Brown has spoken about this publicly, I believe, too. I think he was on the Fifth Estate and maybe other interviews. So he, I think, supports and backs up his own research, I guess it is. But could you explain, I guess, a little more about what you did with the seawater testing and the conclusions from that?
it did not come from the seawater.
Yeah. Okay. So that was what
That was his
he said.
conclusion.
Yeah.
It did not come from the seawater.
Okay.
Now, there's also other individuals involved in this. There's there are two PhDs in the U.S. who are considered to be the American experts on aircraft fires. One is Dr. Quinter, and the other is a Dr. Lyon, Lyon. Dr. Lyon, when I met him, had been working as the head of the FAA burn unit in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Sorry. Um, they have a burn unit and they burn aircraft down there to test them. He had been working there for 9 years, and he said he'd spoken with his supervisor of his crew who had been there for 16 years. And he said in all of their burn tests, they had never melted aluminum aircraft structure unless they added petroleum to the fire, an accelerant petroleum to the fire. There was no petroleum in our fire. The fire occurred without petroleum. So they've been burning the same materials that we had burning in the Swissair aircraft and ended up with an abundant amount of molten aluminum. They've been burning the same stuff and never got molten aluminum unless they added an accelerant. His comment to me in front of two TSB members was, "You had an incendiary device on that plane."
In fact, the evidence of the molten, as I recall from the documentation and the evidence that never was made public, is the molten went like this. What did they call it? The fingers?
Yeah.
Water?
Witch broom.
Which room?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It looks like a witch's broom. You know that
And so when the plane hit the water, the materials of the plane were essentially in a semi-liquid form or a liquid form. How would you
yeah.
explain that?
We had a great big piece of aluminum, molten aluminum that had fallen on one of the one piece of equipment, and it was hefty, and it was the size of, oh gosh, it was the size of my hand. There was that amount. And the thing is to keep in mind, we never had a burn through of the skin of the aircraft, but that skin of the aircraft had been flying at better than 30,000 feet for more than an hour. It was at a temperature of minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 below zero. It would have sucked up any amount of heat that came close to it. It was a heat sink. And yet we still had molten aluminum of the frame holding that skin. That's how much heat was generated in that aircraft.
What temperature would it be?
Well, aluminum melts at over 1100 degrees. We had a ceiling tile that was identified by the company who makes them. Their initial verdict when they tested it was that it had burnt for 5 minutes at 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's I mean, your barbecue, if you get to 300 degrees, that's extremely hot. This was 1700 degrees.
I think one of the
TSB didn't like the results,
well, I think
so
one of
they
the,
went back to them.
yeah.
TSB didn't like the results, went back to them and said, give us the time for 10 minutes. And it came back at something like 1200 degrees, which is still extremely hot. That's above molten aluminum temperatures.
Okay,
The
maybe
thing
this,
is, that piece of tile had nothing above it to burn.
so that means you had to have a sustained temperature. Maybe the next time we come back, we'll talk about the problems with that. But one of the issues that in the way the story was sold, for example, David Suzuki in his The Nature of Things did a piece on this. I think he won awards for it. And
I don't watch David Suzuki.
Stephen Kimber did a book on it. And I think
Yeah.
they both refer to this a short happening, and at the point of the short, as you talked earlier, temperatures can reach 50,000 degrees or some, or 5,000 or 50,000. I can't remember what it is, but only for a microsecond.
A
But they
microsecond,
made
that's
it
all.
sound like the fire was sustained by this 50,000 degree, 5,000, 50,000 degree burst when that's not possible. It was only a microsecond. It couldn't have sustained that fire.
Well, copper melts at something like 1300 degrees, or I think it's under 1500 degrees. Well, it melted and then it froze again. As soon as the electrical current stopped, it immediately froze. And that means the temperature comes down instantly and it captured the air that was around it. Yeah, for that microsecond when the electrical charge is going through, and if you've ever seen uh, a spark from an electrical current, in order to create the light, you need temperatures equivalent to the sun. But that is for the microsecond that occurs. And then it freezes and is no longer at that temperature. So to claim that the temperatures above that attic, in that attic, were in the tens of thousands of degrees is absolutely ridiculous. It would have melted the skin. It would have the front end of the aircraft would have just melted away, and that never occurred.
So, Tom, I agree with Paul here. I'd love to have you back on because there's the second part of this story, which is why didn't the RCMP, why didn't the government of Canada want to know the truth? I mean, we get this with the mass casualty. All right, it looks like the RCMP might have been involved in some way. Well, then they've got a clear motivation to cover it up. Here we have diamonds, maybe $500 million worth of diamonds or gems missing. We have a mysterious person involved in the setup of the plane. We have very strong evidence of an incendiary device on the plane that would have put the plane in the water. And okay, so who's behind that? That whoever that is would seem to certainly have an interest in covering up the truth of the crash. But
Let me throw something else at you.
yeah, please.
There was an individual who was supposed to be a passenger on that plane, but wasn't.
Ah, well. That's well, that's out of Get Shorty. I was thinking earlier of the uh, of Goldfinger, right? The Goldfinger plot is, put a nuclear device next to Fort Knox. You make all the gold toxic, and then him, Oric Goldfinger, with his supply of gold, is now much wealthier. Well, if there's billions of worth of diamonds there, anyway, I'd really like to go through some potential theories as to why people would want to cover this up when it's not obvious who the truth serves.
Well, first
Well,
of all,
let's come back and do
before
that.
going, okay, before going, and let me leave you with this.
Yeah.
Before going to what may have been the cause, just, yeah, either you believe or don't believe that there was an incendiary device on that plane. And the evidence that was covered up was that there actually was a fire device on that plane. And that's what caused the fire, not a short circuited wire.
All right.
Let's
Wow.
come back and talk about that more.
This is a cliffhanger. So we'll Tom, that's great. We're that this is fascinating, and I know the audience is must be loving it as well. So yeah, we'll bring you back in as soon as we can to conclude the conversation and get into the next stages of it. And if you'd be gracious enough to join us, you're building.
Whenever you want me.
Okay, that's great. So to the people out there, we've got to work through some comings and goings of Paul Palango, world traveler. But we'll be back next week one way or another, and we'll get Tom back, if not next week, then very soon to conclude this fascinating tale. All right. Any quick concluding remarks, Paul or Tom?
No, that's it. The end of
Okay.
the summer.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for watching, and thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And wait, Tom, who killed Corey Ellison?